A decade ago, while driving back to Harlem from upstate New York, where I'd spent the weekend with my parents at the Finger Lakes resort they visited every few years, an excursion memorable not only because it was then my father announced I'd been conceived on the resort's second floor in a room on the lakeside — he couldn't remember any longer exactly which one — but also because it was the last time I would see my mother before she was diagnosed with the recurrence of the cancer that would eventually take her life. It was while driving back along I-81 that my Saab 900's exhaust started sending out white smoke, or so a Pennsylvania state trooper would inform me once he pulled me over to ask if my engine had overheated. That was when I first noticed that the needle of the car's temperature gauge was pointing in the wrong direction. We popped open the hood to take a look inside, and foul-smelling steam nearly singed our faces. He laughed as he pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his cheeks and forehead. I wiped mine on my sleeve. The trooper's earlier approach to the car had put me at ease. His slow, deliberate movements, his measured, cheery tone, intended, I thought, to announce he was just there to help. And his reaction now only reinforced the message. He was bone white, his features boyish, though there was something ancient about his vaulted cheekbones and his Tartar slant to his eyes. Polish or Serbian, I thought, though the last name on his tag betrayed no obvious ethnic origin: Matthew. As we stepped away from the car, he pointed ahead at an exit. We weren't far from Clark's Summit, he said, where there was a garage. He suspected that was where AAA would take me, though he had to admit he'd only ever heard bad things about the service there. I know a garage in Scranton where I always go. It's a little farther, but they'll come get you with their own truck. I know the owner. They do great work. I'd be happy to call him for you. It was a bright, mild day in late October. The surrounding hills were ablaze with autumn color. As Trooper Matthew and I waited for the tow truck, his cruiser between us and the traffic's noisy ebb and flow, he turned to me and asked, entirely benignly, I thought, where my name was from. I knew from experience that an honest answer to this not infrequent question could raise suspicions where there might otherwise have been none. My well-intentioned interlocutor suddenly beclouded by some reflexive evocation of terror. In the trying months after 9/11, when the simple act of mounting the city bus and paying my fare had become a provocation met with fearful watching glares, I'd settled on a prophylactic strategy. India, I would say. It was a lie. The name wasn't Indian. But I knew the question usually masked a curiosity about my origins, and as you already know, my parents were born in what was then India. This answer had the obvious advantage of connoting not the reference of terror, murder, and rage that most associated with Pakistan, but rather the bright colors and spicy tastes of delightful dishes like tikka masala, gyrating flash mobs in Bollywood movies, and yoga pants. To complicate all this further, my name is actually Egyptian. And depending on the political moment, in the wake of attacks like those on tourists at Luxor and Sharm el-Sheikh, or 2 years later during the misleading months of the so-called Arab Spring, mentioning Egypt can become a prompt to more questions, each riddled with a particular pitfall that often leads to the very sort of mistrust I am ever keen to avoid in the first place. If all this sounds somewhat paranoid, I'm happy for you. Clearly, you have not been beset by daily worries of being perceived and therefore treated as a foe of the Republic rather than a member of it. Standing alongside Officer Matthews, surrounded by the painted hills, grateful for his charitable interest in my vehicle's proper repair, disarmed by gratitude, I opted for the complicated truth. The name is Egyptian, I said. Really? My parents aren't from Egypt, but when my father first came to this country, he had an Egyptian friend who had my name. He'd never heard it before and really liked it, so when I was born, he used it for me. Funny thing is, he doesn't say it right, or at least not how he heard it said by his friend. How are you supposed to say it? I joked my way through the various pronunciations of my name. The original Arabic, which sounded nothing like how my parents said it, and which was different still from the way my kindergarten teacher had coined the American pronunciation, which had stuck ever since. So why couldn't your parents say it right? They don't speak Arabic. They're not Arabs. Well, no, they're from Pakistan. So actually, they were born in India, but that's a long story. And you all moved here from Pakistan when you were in kindergarten? I was born here. He paused for a moment, picking lint off the stiff felt dome of his wide-brimmed trooper hat. From somewhere upwind of us, the sweet smell of burning applewood was pouring into the air. So where were you born? He asked, suddenly tentative. It was clear I'd made a mistake. Wisconsin, I said. It was another lie. Though I spent almost the entirety of my childhood and adolescence in Wisconsin, I was born on Staten Island. Wisconsin, though, felt like a stronger move in this negotiation around the impression forming inside him. Never been, he said. I just read this book, The Looming Tower. You heard of it? It won the Pulitzer last year, didn't it? It's pretty incredible. I know the writer, Lawrence Wright. Great guy. I'd recently met Lawrence, or Larry, as he introduced himself, at a reading of a play he'd written about the Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci. We'd spoken afterward, an encounter I doubt he would recall, and during which I would wonder if, in fact, his sympathies with Fallaci's troubling views on Islam were deeper than he was letting on in the play he'd written. In short, I was misrepresenting both my affection for and proximity to this famous writer in an obvious attempt to signal status and amiability, to get Trooper Matthew off whatever suspicions I worried he was now harboring. He continued, I never knew that the guy who ran the whole crew of hijackers was from Egypt. For some reason, I thought they were all from Iraq. I thought that's why we went to Iraq. See, but the truth is, none of them was from Iraq. Not a one. They were mostly from Saudi and Mohammed Atta. The guy in charge, he was from Egypt, Cairo, actually. So quickly had we arrived via my father's best friend on the subject of Atta. My grandfather was stationed in Cairo during the World War. We had a picture of him in front of the pyramids. I used to dream about visiting when I grew up, standing there where Grandpa did. I had no idea the kind of hate they got for us. I bit my lip, literally, and nodded, hoping my silence would appear respectful. I gotta say, for guys who are pure evil, Trooper Matthew added, the book almost made me understand them. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I felt for them or anything like that. I mean, they're monsters. But when you see what happens in their countries and how messed up everything is for them and how hard it is for folks who live there, well, you start to get how they are seeing the world. You can understand how they start thinking Disneyland's really the problem with everything. Disneyland? Yeah. Atta, he hated Disneyland, thought America was turning the world into a theme park. Moments earlier, I hadn't known better than to speak. Now, I was certain silence was necessary. He was fishing, his tone no longer declarative, but slipping at the ends of phrases into the ostensible friendliness of the interrogative. I mean, you can almost understand a guy like that. You know what I mean? You think? I don't know. I do. I really do. He paused again and glanced at me, I thought, with a look that drew out more distinctly the tapering almond shape of his eyes. You know what? When he returned his rental car on September 9th, he called the rental agency to tell him the oil light was on. You believe that? He didn't care about the 3,000 people they killed, but he cared about the next person driving the car. You believe that? I wouldn't if I saw it in a movie. The book sounds amazing, I said, after a short pause. Right, he said, distantly. I should probably get on the horn and make sure those guys are on their way. The hat found his head again as he walked back to the driver's side to make his call. He was still on the phone running his check on me, I assumed, when the flatbed truck with Marek Auto Repair pulled up. The tow driver was a short, stocky man in denim overalls whose face was covered with blistering acne. He huddled over the engine to inspect. Yep, said, busted head gasket. You guys can fix that, right? Shouldn't be a problem. I looked over at the cruiser where Trooper Matthew's face was lowered, phone still to his ear. The tow driver backed up the truck and lowered the flatbed. Once the cables were attached, the truck's squealing winch pulled my car up into place. It wasn't until the car was mounted, until we'd gotten into the ready to go, Trooper Matthew finally emerged and made his way to the tow truck's driver's side window. He and the driver spoke about someone they both knew. I could tell he was ignoring me. I looked forward and did the same. As the conversation came to an end, the trooper put his hand on the door frame and leaned in. Staten Island, right? It took me a moment to realize he was addressing me. What's that? Staten Island. That's where you were born, not Wisconsin. Isn't that right? He was staring at me now, his blank look less of a provocation than an acknowledgement of betrayal. Whether his or mine, I couldn't tell. What to say? How to explain that I'd been worried he had the wrong idea about me, and I lied to let him know I was not the enemy he worried I might be. Was there really no way to convey this simple truth through the thicket of mistrust that has so quickly grown between us? If there was, I didn't see it. So I lied again. Oh, no, that's wrong. It's a long story. My response didn't seem to surprise him. You know, you can always get that taken care of. All you have to do is take your birth certificate in. It was never a problem for me before, sir, but thank you. I heard my combative tone. I hadn't intended it. He looked away, his tongue lodged against the inside of his cheek, fighting, I thought, the urge to allow, even encourage, an escalation. Okay, he said, finally patting the door frame with his palm. Hope everything works out with the car. Have a good day. Thank you very much. And now I'll turn it over to our conversation this evening and to our guest of honor, Ayad Akhtar. Thank you.
Great. Well, that was remarkable. It was a terrific reading, a terrific surprise. And we could all be so lucky to have our first reading dealt with for us. And we're going to unpack, I think, a lot of the dynamics in that particular scene in our conversation. Yeah. I wanted to start, it's interesting for you, someone who is, most established and known as a playwright. Hearing your work read aloud is not a new experience, of course.
Right.
And the question I had for you that I wanted to begin the conversation, and I'll start with some praise for this book. When I read this, and I said this to you, I put this down at the end. It was an electric reading experience that I hope everybody who's watching will have. And I really felt like I just read something that had made a run at being in the canon of the great American novel. And I mean, literally in the company of the works that we consider to be great American novels. And so where I wanted to start this conversation is, as someone who's been in so many different forms, and I know this question is coming in different ways. It's coming as, why didn't you write a memoir? Because the main character is Ayad Akhtar, and it has so much overlap with elements of your life. But actually, more fundamentally, I wanted to ask you, as someone who's been a playwright, and who's written for television, and who's written for films, as we learned in The New Yorker. I didn't know that. Why a novel? I mean, there's so much you want to put into this, clearly, what you had to say in this book. Why the form of a novel? Was there something about how America has been dealt with in novels throughout history? Is there something about that form that led you to tell this story in this particular form?
Thanks, Ben. And for doing this. So I was saying, there maybe is a part of me that wants to deflect. When I had a high school teacher who changed my life when I was 15. She made me want to become a writer, and I always wanted to be a novelist. I mean, that was what I always dreamed of being. And I had a college professor, my first short story that I wrote in a class, that sort of really loved this short story and sort of called me into his office and said, I think this is one of the best short stories I've read by a student, and I'd like you to send it to the New Yorker and the Atlantic, and here are their addresses. I know them. I know the editors, the fiction editors there. And I was so blown away. I remember walking out of his office and being sort of full of something, and then realizing I was never going to send the story because I didn't know where the story had come from, and I didn't know how I would write another story. So I started writing fiction, but I stopped showing fiction to anybody for many, 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 many years. And I started writing for the theater. I mean, I started acting and directing, and for some reason that was not a place where this constellated, this whole issue of wanting to be a writer. It felt like I could just learn to be a writer and not worry about wanting to be a writer. And so in a way, I think in wanting to address the nation at this moment, because the book came out of a complicated emotional moment where my mom had passed away and my father was showing signs of decline, and obviously what had happened to our country, you know, Trump's ascension to the office and the sort of disrepair. I wanted to respond. And I think that the part of me that wanted to respond was the deepest part of me, the oldest part of me, the part of me that really still, fiction somehow is tied in with some original impulse to write. And so I think that there's an energy inside that, in the prose and inside the book, that connects me all the way back to my beginnings as a writer. And maybe the aspiration is part of that, is, you know, the aspiration has to do with that.
You've got, you know, something that I notice is the oppositional nature of some of the forces in the book, right? And this is something you and I've chatted about a little bit, but I want to unpack different pieces of this. You know, the foundation of the book is a book that deals with the big themes of America, right? I mean, money and foreign policy and identity and all the rest of it. The foundation, right, is your family story and your parents. And you have a father, the main character has a father who kind of idolizes America. And that even leads him to idolize Donald Trump, for whom he's been a doctor, right? And you have a mother who is skeptical and kind of has a longing for the Pakistan of her birth. I was wondering how you thought about, you know, your parents are key characters in this story. How you thought of those two oppositional views of America and what it is as central to the way in which you built the story that you tell, and how you worked through that as you went along.
So way, you know, question to me, that's what I hear. I mean, of course, there's content there, but as a dramatic writer, I'm always thinking in terms of oppositions, and I'm always thinking in terms of conflict, and that if you can move a character from one pole to the opposite of that, that's the strongest movement that has the most energy for an audience. It creates the most sense of engagement and the most uncertainty around the outcome. And so in building the parents whose political points of view were going to be the two poles against which this narrator was going to come of age himself and his relationship to America, my father's embrace of American opportunity, in this case, debt-filled and steroids, you know, individualism on steroids, if you will, right? I pushed him a little bit further, maybe, than he really was, in order to have some space that I could begin to maneuver with. There was some open space there. And on the other side, my mother's anti-Americanism, which is not unique to her, or was not unique to her. And she was also, there were things she loved about America, but she also had some real problems with the United States that she never really got over. And a common thing sort of in the Muslim world and in much of the Muslim world is a sort of sympathy for Islamism, or a sympathy for a kind of militant post-colonial response. And, you know, post 9/11 became much more problematic to own that because the consequences were so significant. But pre 9/11, there was a sense that the West had been pretty murderous, and sometimes you needed to take up arms to sort of fight for your own interests, right? And so my mother's sympathies in the book tend the opposite direction, and sort of they're outrageous in a different way. You know, she has sympathies with bin Laden. And so between those two poles are two visions of modernity in the American age, right? One is this acceptance of the limitlessness of American desire and America's ability to sort of reshape the world, even outrageously and stupidly, as the case, you know, being Donald Trump. And on the other hand, this sort of post-colonial response, militant response to that power. And so between those two poles, the narrator's constantly trying to figure out as a child what he should be thinking of America. And those two poles define really the outline of the relationship or the critique of the United States that the book engages in.
And, to draw out this theme of the critique of the United States, but also this sense of opposition, and this relates to the excerpt that we heard read so well. You're reading this book that is this, in some ways a classic American story of someone making it, right? Of somebody making a fortune, of somebody becoming prominent in their field and winning a Pulitzer Prize. And at the same time, though, while that's happening, in part because of the post 9/11 dynamic of being a Muslim in America, there's this very complicated relationship with power, because you're ascending to the circles in which there's money and power, and yet you're on the other end of that exchange with the trooper. You have a harrowing 9/11 experience where you can feel viscerally all that is coming when you try to give blood and you're essentially heckled. Multiple experiences, of course, of being cast as an outsider. I'm wondering, what is it like to be, and how do you think in writing this to capture for people the complexity of making it, of making the American dream, right? You're making money and you're successful, and yet you're being pushed further away from some conception of power. It seems like that's very much a story for our times, and I'm wondering how you thought about that dynamic of, the classic American character making it and yet being more of an outsider to the concept of power that you portray in the novel.
Incredible. So many to it. I think that the simplest response would be that I knew that this book, which was going to be a kind of staging of the self in the era of social media, where the process of curating the self for others is the central subject, the central object of people's focus and relation, that their notion of who they think they are and who they want to present themselves to be is really their dominant mode of relating to reality. So I knew that the staging of the self was going to be a central part of the book. And I knew that a rise to success and the sort of achieving of the American dream, if you will, was going to be central to that experience. But I think that what I hoped, and I don't, I'm not sure how folks respond to it. I mean, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I think it depends on whether they think it's me or not me that's actually had this experience. Is that I don't know that we live in an era where achieving the American dream actually resolves anything. And I think that's the dilemma, is that, you can buy into what, is now just called the sort of neoliberal dream of success, if you will, right? Where you have a kind of enlightened political point of view, but you are still, well compensated and you're wealthy and you can have the things you want to have. You can have great Bordeaux's but your relationship to the capitalist model and the capitalist system is such that you benefit off of it, and you are perhaps not as aware as you're maybe somewhat more aware than some people about the predations that's predicated on, but you're not necessarily as aware as people who are not part of that system. And so I wanted to show that rise and this sort of rise into that, because it seems to me that one of the myths about the American experience is that belonging happens when you make it. When you make it, you belong. And making it doesn't mean a Pulitzer. Very clearly in this book, it does not mean that. It means money. That until you have money, you don't have freedom in America. So I'm not sure if exactly answers your question, but that's where it takes me.
But it's interesting to me because your father makes and loses fortune a couple of times, right? How would you cast his sense of belonging in the book? Why does I won't spoil the ending, but in terms of what happens to your father and where he ends up, but as someone who went before you in this experience of becoming an American, did money make him feel like he belonged? Did being Donald Trump's doctor make him feel that he belonged? Did living in a Wisconsin suburb that was majority white make him feel that he belonged? What is it that offers that sense of belonging as American?
Well, I think for my father in the book, that I think that he has a dream that he will belong, and he is chasing that dream, and he's doing a pretty good job. At times he's not doing such a good job, but makes a lot of money, then loses a lot of money, and he has this idea of himself as a self-made man, even though he's an academic physician. I mean, but then he keeps trying to start private practices, and then he fails. But the notion of being an entrepreneur, the notion of making it by dint of your own efforts and coming into wealth is the dream. And it happens for him a few times, but it never does give him that experience fundamentally. But he doesn't recognize that. I think he continues to believe that there is some level. And in the book, there's a hedge fund manager who is of my generation who is chasing $1 billion. He's trying to become a billionaire. And so in a way, it suggests that possibly the category of being a billionaire is this very elect or select or elite, kind of the landed gentry of the American experience or the American experiment. Those with real political power, those with $1 billion plus. Those are the people who actually make our nation. None of those questions are resolved. Obviously, for my father, they do get resolved, and I won't spoil it. But he doesn't ever fundamentally resolve his sense of belonging with America.
I was struck, to this question of belonging and being American, because I felt like this is a book. I know, Ayad, you have to speak for the experience of being Muslim in America after 9/11 so much. Yeah. But this is a book about being American and what that identity is. And you begin and end with a professor from Brown. You begin in her classroom. You have this kind of amazing overture about essentially what it feels like to be American in 2020, which is not always a pleasant experience. But you take us back to her classroom where you're learning about Emerson and Whitman, these giants of American literature who did this work of defining what it's like to be American. And then you end back with her in a really riveting scene. But I'm wondering whether that there's an idea that even for those of us like you and me who were born here, that being American is something learned. And because you talk about Islam in a similar way, a different identity is something learned through text. And I'm wondering, as someone who's been at this nexus of writing about identity, how much did you mean to convey that idea that we need to figure out for ourselves just what this means to be American? And we're at a time when it seems like, Donald Trump, probably most people watching this, don't feel like he gives them a sense of belonging, right? I mean, how do you go about learning to be an American, and how much was that on your mind as you framed this book?
I feel like that's an amazing question, and I don't have an answer to it. In the sense that I think that in a way the space of the book, the kind of texture of the book, is a constant restless question, and I think I'm able to access the vividness inside that uncertainty, because at some point in the not so distant past, I somehow ceased to need an answer. And I don't know how that happened. I don't know at what point I stopped caring whether I was American or wasn't American, or whether I knew what it felt like or didn't. I just knew I was having experiences and that they were hitting me in different ways for different reasons. And all of a sudden, in not needing or wanting to resolve any of that, I was able to just write about being inside that all the time. And so in a way, I think the disorientation of the jostling notions of being American and them not really ever quite being resolved. If they get resolved for some people, I have an uncle who converts to Christianity to solve his dilemma of American belonging. Riaz, the finance guy, he thinks if he can get to $1 billion, and, the book makes a case that he probably does feel American. But then there's a kind of twist there, and my father never quite resolves it. My mother doesn't resolve it. Asha, the narrator's girlfriend, seems to resolve it at one point, but then she resolves it in this very unusual way that kind of brings Pakistan and her parents' homeland to America in a new internet age type way. So anyway, all of that to say that I think the question of belonging is one that remains very much a question in the book. And I'm not sure I'm any the wiser after having written the book, but I think I might be a little bit more at peace with not knowing, if that makes sense.
Maybe that's part of the answer, is that being American is that you don't necessarily have to figure it all out, right? Well, a couple more questions before we open up. Because the one that's related to this, the 9/11 story is so rivetingly rendered, and you do present this kind of opposing choice that's made by certain Muslims after 9/11, in that, to avoid scrutiny, to avoid being attacked, to avoid being heckled, to avoid encounters like the one that we heard in the reading, you wore a cross. Whereas Asha and some of the other characters, just put up flags. And I thought that was a very powerful, kind of subtle, different choice, right? To assert a nationalism versus to assert a different religion. And I just wondered if you could unpack that a little bit. Why the main character of Ayad Akhtar in this novel, is drawn to taking a step that suggests that they need to advertise a different religious identity, whereas a lot of other people, it was just no, we hung a lot of flags after 9/11.
Right. A very subtle distinction and an important one. In the section that Asif read, it's the beginning of a sequence called Scranton Memoirs, which all takes place in Scranton. And the journey, the narrator's car breaks down, and then he meets there are four people who are discussed who have Christian names. And the first is Matthew, the second is Mark, the third is Luke, and the last is John. And the chapter is called God's Country. So it's really a journey through the heartland in which this architecture, the literary architecture, if you will, is religious. The symbolism is religious. And at the center of that chapter is a long passage about how we, at least in my family and the families that I knew, saw this country fundamentally as Christian. That it was to us a Christian nation, and that many people wouldn't necessarily understand this. Agnostics or atheists or secular humanists, they wouldn't see this country as Christian, but to us, it was. And so that is something that runs throughout the entire book, so that later at 9/11, when this narrator tries to pass, his strategy similarly is that his identity is not national. It's not that his parents are from Pakistan. It's that he's Muslim, that the religious identity is first and foremost. And I've often thought, at least in my experience, that for so many of us who are Muslim, that seems to be something that we often share. I won't say for everybody, but many of us, I think, do share that. And so, and maybe it's similar to being Jewish. I don't know. I mean, I imagine that there's some predominancy there to the sense of belonging to this tribe or this way of this history, really. And so that's how it's again stitched in, that there's these opposing views, the national view versus the religious view, and none of them obviously get resolved. But for the narrator, the religious one is the central one.
And it which makes chilling sense, right, in a way. But one other question I want to ask you, I know we want to get to the audience too, of course, and is as someone who worked on the issues I worked on, the idea of America never ends at America's borders, and America ends up shaping the directions of whole countries. And there's so many sub threads to this book, and we could spend a lot of time talking about money in America, which you deconstruct brilliantly here, but I also Pakistan. The narrator's uncle being at the nexus of the CIA's effort to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s, and receiving funding to build what he wants to be a health clinic, but it treats the Mujahideen. But then when the Taliban comes to power, he gets crosswise. Suddenly the same people that were funding his efforts are now telling him he's an extremist. And you see how, America built essentially the infrastructure that became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and their dramatic shift had this massive destabilizing effect in Pakistan. And to me, what I was really struck by is you go to Abbottabad, which I'm sure I pronounce differently than people in Pakistan do. But the narrator's family is from Abbottabad, which is where bin Laden was. And I remember in government, in the run up to the bin Laden operation, people were watching like these people burn their trash at this house. We're counting how many women are there that might match bin Laden's wives. We're trying to pull this thread on whether bin Laden is in this compound, which part of the reason why we were so surprised that he was there is that this is in the town that is basically the West Point of Pakistan. And we had this puzzle, like, could the Pakistanis have known? And your narrator said every Pakistani knows that the government must have known bin Laden was there and must have been on the take, because else could have been there. I mean, I say the anecdote just because it's so rich, but I do want to ask the question of essentially how much did, you talk about Pakistani immigrants to America, but how much did America shape Pakistan in the book that that you're writing here and in the history of it, and how much is that a bottom-out example in that bin Laden story, weirdly in this kind of space in between how America and Pakistan have interacted that you tell?
I'm on my way to walk in Central Park just a few days ago, and as I often find myself a bit in awe of your ability to sort of synthesize and put a picture of the world together. You made a case, I think, for America's influence really shaping many things that we don't even recognize as American. We're saying some stuff about the contemporary Chinese Communist Party, really, late stage capitalism on steroids. There's something that the United States has been shaping the world, even in instances where we don't think that that's what's happening. We see them as opposites or polar opposites of ourselves. In fact, they're taking their example from us. And that, in a way, at the center of this book is not just an investigation or, a kind of a journey through the American experience in America. It's a journey through the American experience for those who are not American outside America, and what America means to them because it's in their lives all the time, and because they shape themselves in relation to all of that. So anyway, I couldn't do better than what you were saying in the park. So maybe you could say a few words about that.
I'll say one thing before I give it to Karina. I mean, again, because this is what's so interesting in this book is it forces you to think about all the ways in which America has shaped the lives of individuals in America, the course of events, and just as one, through your family story, the narrator's story, it shaped Pakistan in a more mujahideen direction that produced bin Laden. Bin Laden ends up all the way in Abbottabad, and then America has to go kill him there. Right, and then you, as an American of Pakistani descent, or the narrator, is dealing with the consequences of that in New York City. I mean, the connections that are drawn in this novel, some subtle, some very direct. I spent a lot, I guarantee you, if you read this book, and I hope everybody does, you will be thinking about those connections in ways that you haven't before for a very long time.
This is one thing to that. The incredible team at Little Brown, we worked on the cover, they worked on the cover for a really long time, and we went through a bunch of different, and it finally landed on that tree with the roots. And what you're describing is really, that's the whole book. It's that one root is connected to all of these other things, is connected to the branches way above ground, and not everything is interconnected in that way. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, so Karina, yeah, I know you're gonna call some questions here, yeah.
That was amazing. Thank you both so much. And I'm Karina Lesser. I'm the Artistic Director of Scripps Presents, and I'm very pleased to help facilitate tonight's Q&A. And the first question we have is actually from a member of PEN America, based here in Los Angeles. And we're going to bring her up on the screen. Ahktar, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks for being here. This was such a great conversation. And congratulations on your new role with PEN. I'm so excited to see what you do with the org. I was reading the interview that was in the New York Times when you were in conversation with John Williams, and I wanted to ask you to delve a little bit more into something you said during that interview at the very end. you said, I've always taken an apolitical stance with regards to literature because I'm not convinced that literature is the best way to form political opinions. And, it's fascinating to hear someone like you say that, because when I read your work, it feels impossible to rend the political from the literary. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that, and if not, to help kind of shape readers' convictions and thus political opinions, how do you view the role of literature?
Got it. That's a great question. Thank you. I think that, my greatest mentor, somebody who's been so many great, he's been a mentor to so many of the greatest writers, and so much greater than myself, Shakespeare. And I read Shakespeare every day. I say that a little more than I probably should, because it tends to make critics think that you're making yourself look really, good, and tells audiences that you think, that what you're doing is boring, that Shakespeare is considered boring. But in fact, one of the things that I find so extraordinary about Shakespeare is that you never know what his opinion about anything is. His ability to really mirror consciousness, whether it's the consciousness of power, or the consciousness of the disadvantaged, or the consciousness of the Catholic or the Protestant, or consciousness of anything, is so there's such a transparency there that there's never a sense of what his personal politics are. So I've always felt that politics, having a political opinion in that respect as an artist, is a liability to the ability to see and shape and experience for the sake of making work. So that's the context of the comment that I made. And then, secondarily, I'd say, of course, politics itself and our life as a city, as a polis, and our being together, our life in the polis, our life as political animals, as political creatures, that's an important subject of literature, yes. But I am still not convinced that literature is going to tell me that I should vote for this person. I mean, this particular election, I don't think you need literature to know who to vote for. But in a more normal universe, I'm not sure that politics is ever real. I mean, literature is ever really going to tell you who you should vote for. That was what I sort of meant in that comment.
Wonderful, thank you. And I should say, as long as you're comfortable with this, Ayad, Ben, if there is anything you want to chime in on, there's lots of great questions here, so
totally comfortable.
Feel free. The next question I have here is, how has your view of what it means to be American shifted over your lifetime?
Ben, do you have a thought about that?
First of all, I want to apologize. And I think my failure to mute myself earlier created the problems at the beginning. So I want to just own that. I've made so many mistakes in this Zoom world. I think, I do, well, it's a long story, but I'm sorry for that.
It's okay.
My view has changed a lot. And as we talked, you referenced our walk in the park. What I was saying to Ayad the other day is, the book I'm working on is part of an effort to kind of figure this out. I think that I obviously came from about as privileged a position as you could. A white guy from New York City, from a relatively an upper middle class background. But then underneath that, mixed heritage, Jewish and Christian, father from Texas, mother from New York, like the strangeness was of the American being was present in my identity. But I think as an American, what's so jarring to me in the Trump years, as someone obviously who was on the full Obama journey, I think I had an assumption of the inevitable positive direction of events. And I was in a generation that came of age, we won the Cold War, and the arc of history was moving in a certain direction. And horrific things happened, like 9/11 and the Iraq War. But even then, still, like, we can be corrective, and Barack Obama can get elected. And the Trump presidency has forced me to consider that there's no inevitability to the positive direction of events. and that the meaning of being an American for me, as I reflected on it, was very tied up, interestingly, in growing up at the end of the Cold War, when everybody kind of knew there was a broad sense of purpose that our political leaders, at least, kind of could all have agreed upon. Everybody could have articulated who the good guys were in the world and the bad guys. I'm not saying they were all right all the time, but that was the milieu that I grew up in. And to me, what I've come to realize that being American, what's most important is the fact that we're from everywhere. That there are Whitman, I contain multitudes, I think is probably the most important phrase I can think about American identity, that's the exceptionalism. It's not just our power and our money and our military, or even frankly, like our founding documents alone. It's the fact that every strand of humanity is in America. And so America encompasses the world. And that is what I privilege the most about being American, is that you could live somewhere that is shaped by everybody, people from everywhere. And frankly, outsiders from everywhere, because everybody came here from somewhere else except for indigenous peoples, some against their will, but most on their own accord. So to me, that's a change. It went from this idea that we're Americans, we're the good guys, we have this kind of Cold War cause that we prevailed upon, and then even when we screwed up, we just had to get back to doing the right thing, and more about American being something that encompasses the complexity of all of human identity. And that's why this is such a contested political time, because that idea of America is the antithesis of Donald Trump and Steve Miller's idea, which is America's for a certain set of people. And frankly, they'd rather the other people not be here or leave or just be subjugated. So that's been an evolving process for me. But I would land on America containing multitudes, which, is something that can be embraced, even though it was written by Walt Whitman 150 years ago, I think by a lot of us.
I find that it's very inspiring what you just said. Because I'm somewhat more cynical about American power, and I feel that we as a country have tried to move the needle in generally a somewhat more positive direction historically, at least in the last 80 years than maybe others who have ruled the world at different points. But I think that American exceptionalism, I do think there is something exceptional about that period of American history. We may be exiting that. I don't know. I think it's not clear to us. But if we exit it, I don't think it's about our ideas. I think it's about the waning of our ability to be a force, a strength. And I think much of that is economic. And I think that we are losing the economic game because we have ceased, and we stopped about 40 years ago, caring about the country and really have been legislating individual accumulation of wealth. We've made it philosophically totally acceptable to sell off our national infrastructure to make people rich. And we're 40 years into that now. So we're not going to undo that overnight, but we're now seeing the ramifications of that on the world stage. And I think that, it won't matter what our ideas are. It won't matter if we're a juster society for the world at a certain point, because we're not going to have the strength to project any of those ideas to anybody else. It'll be better here, but it'll also be worse, because being in pole position as the strongest nation in the world, if you will, gives us advantages that we don't even recognize. But once they're gone, we're going to see the consequences of that. So I think it's a fascinating back and forth, because I think we're close, but on just opposite sides of the line.
Thank you. And the next question we have is, what is your view on the current Palestine, Mideast, America diplomatic developments?
Well, that's really a question for Ben. That's really not a question for me.
What I find very strange about it, is the description of it as a peace agreement. For a variety of reasons. Number one, traditionally that's related to the Palestinians making peace with Israel and having self-determination in a state of their own, and they're completely excluded from this agreement that was reached. Number two, the Gulf countries that are party to this agreement, and two of them were represented, but implicitly I think it was on behalf of the broader, the Saudi-led Gulf bloc, are engaged in a war in Yemen that's killed over 100,000 people. That wasn't discussed at the White House today. Tens of thousands of children are at risk of famine because of that agreement. That wasn't discussed at the White House today. None of America's wars in the region were ended. The reason and fundamental rationale behind it, I think, was driven by an opposition to Iran that risks additional war and conflict in the Middle East. Whatever you think of the Iranian regime, there's much to criticize. So the framing was troubling to me, not just by Trump, but by the way this kind of cast in the media. It's a normalization deal, which is good for Israel. It's good that two additional countries, albeit small ones, that Israel has not fought wars with. So this is not Egypt and Jordan, who have been engaged in multiple wars with Israel. But why was this a deal reached? It was reached because it was in the interests of the individual leaders, and their interests were not peace. Their interests were power. And so even though there are benefits to it that I think are worth noting for the people of Israel to be accepted by more of the community of nations, including Arab nations, I don't diminish that. I think it doesn't resolve the fundamental challenges that I see in that part of the world, and the pageantry of it, to me, and this is, I'll tie it back to your book real quick, Ayad, which is that where are the people? This was a pageantry. It was leaders, wealthy, and powerful leaders doing something to advance their political interests. What about the people of Yemen? What about the Palestinians? What about the people who suffered in the wars in that region? What about the people who suffer repression in these countries? What about the country of Bahrain, which is a very odd political dynamic in which a very small and wealthy Sunni minority governs a collection of Shia and foreign workers? People are not present. And what I like about your work so much, Ayad, is that it focuses in on the people in this country and everywhere. And I didn't see the people in this agreement.
If you laughing, sort of smiling through your response, it was just I saw you parsing your words, and I know how strongly you feel about it. So yeah, I don't have it. I don't, I couldn't say anything more eloquent than what Ben had to say about that. So thank you for that question.
So we have a question about your new book, and it says, you've written about your parents before in American Dervish, but they are far more compelling in Homeland Elegies. Is it time that allowed you to make your parents, particularly your father, so unforgettable?
The last chapter of the book is about my father. It's about 100 pages, about a quarter of the book. And the day that I finished that chapter, literally, I was sitting at my desk and I finished that chapter about my father and his journey in America. It's called How My Father's American Journey Ends. I get a call from my brother about an hour later, and he says, "Oh, Dad's hit his head, and he's going to the emergency room, and he was in ICU, and then he passed away." I was writing about my parents after my mom had passed away, and I was writing about my father just as he was sort of entering the very end of his life, and I didn't have any illusions. I got not so many illusions anymore about my parents. I saw them as people, and I love them dearly, and they're larger than life characters. I've gone to, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of my relationship with my parents, and also my, writing about them because they're such amazing characters. I'm heartened to hear that somebody thinks that the portrayal is more compelling than it was in American Dervish. I'm glad.
And this is our final question, and it can go to both of you. What are you reading these days?
I'm reading the third biography of Augustus that I have been, I've been working my way through various Augustus biographies, the Roman emperor. So I'm reading the third now, and I have arcane reasons for doing that, but I'm always reading weird stuff like that. So I can't recommend it. It's a great book, but I don't know why anybody would want to be reading about Augustus. So.
Any other things on the back?
Yeah, in part because I am working on this book, and I have, Ayad, you on this question of what it means to be American. I'm probably moving more and more in your direction. So I'm reading your book again, but I'm also gone back to James Baldwin, which is an interesting experience. I was actually just talking to my mother about this, how, and I think your book might be like this, Ayad. The guy could have been writing today, it's so on the nose to the debates we're having here today about identity and representation and race and economics as well. So I'm reading Baldwin, and I'm reading Ahktar. And you deserve to be in that company with this book, Ayad. I really do mean it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm getting a little echo, so I don't know if someone needs to mute. It was really just such an amazing conversation, and we feel lucky to be able to spend publication day with you, Ayad. And I hope everyone is nabbing their copy of Homeland Elegies. As Clarice mentioned at the top of the program, Scripps Presents is the public programming series at Scripps College in Southern California. Our programming, which features writers, artists, and scholars from across the disciplines, seeks to complement the dynamic contemporary humanities education that Scripps offers. We're so honored to be partnering with PEN America and the Strand this fall on these vital and timely conversations. I'd like to invite you to join us the next time. We'll be speaking with the remarkable poet Claudia Rankin, whose new book, Just Us, will be out later this month. And she'll be joined by the culture critic and Northwestern professor, Lauren Michelle Jackson. That's on September 30th at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Pacific Time. Again, thank you so much, Ayad and Ben. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you to all of you who joined us. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.